Today's guest is Clint Gibler. He's the head of security research at Semgrep, the creator of the widely respected newsletter TLDRsec, and the Modern Security podcast. Today's conversations, we're going to talk about how AI is reshaping everything from threat modeling to pen testing to the security of AI workloads. And what's that mean for security teams? So, Clint, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So let's dive right into it. Clint, you have said like in the next 2 years, you believe that AI is going to match entry-level positions like early penetration testers. I'd love to get your perspective on that and what you're seeing there.
Sure. I would say I think there's also some nuance there in terms of let's say consistency and breadth. Like so, for example, like look at the most complex or like average bug a junior penetration tester might find, and you'll be like, oh, this AI system can find bugs of that level of technical complexity. But then there's additional questions in terms of if you point the system at the same web application 20 times, how many times does it continually find like the same bug or bugs? Because obviously LLMs being sort of non-deterministic and probabilistic, I think consistency is also an important factor. But I think we already see some very cool write-ups from companies like Expo,
Yeah.
Runcible,
Yeah.
that already have like detailed write-ups of like, here's in my opinion, as someone who did security consulting for like 5-6 years, like some pretty non-trivial bugs.
Yeah.
So there's still many nuances and unanswered questions, but I think in terms of can AI-based penetration testing systems find interesting bugs? The answer is already yes today. But we can go in if you want. There's I feel like a bunch of things we don't know yet. But at least at a high level, I think things are promising.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I think there's a point there in that like not all entry level pen testers are created equal, right? You have some brilliant minds that AI may not be able to play with, but I think if we're talking about the average penetration tester coming out of college, that sounds like it makes sense. So I guess the obvious question is the kids or the career changers who are going down that route. What do they do? Where do they go?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's been a number of people, including myself, like Daniel Miessler, I think has written blog posts on this about, is the on-ramp ladder to the security industry sort of falling away due to various either SOC analyst AI systems, auto pen testing tools, like are they just doing the same job for cheaper than a human?
Yes.
And then the obvious question, which you would know better than me, is like, how do you make a senior security person? Well, they're a junior person who has time and opportunity. So I think there is some risk there, but the other half of that is what if they have a sort of hacking co-pilot, which is with them every step of the way, and similar to people using ChatGPT to learn things, like they can learn better and faster.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure exactly what it's going to look like. I think hopefully companies will still invest in the next generation, realizing that like, yeah, we do want there to be senior and staff level people in the future.
Yeah.
And I think that in many ways, it's a better time to learn than ever, because there's a lot of frustrating things when you're learning where, for example, there's like some Python project you're trying to get to work and like the build isn't working and you have to troubleshoot dependencies and then you're just miserable for an hour.
And it just superpowers juniors, right? Like you talk publicly about using Claude to superpower your own engineering. So do you think I think it's a great point. Like the new junior penetration tester should have almost an equivalent by their side, right? So do you think the expectation potentially for junior talent is just to be better?
Yeah, I think people who are ambitious and self-motivated, it's maybe the best time to learn there's ever been.
Yeah.
In terms of there's an always-on senior person you can ask infinite questions to, and you won't be embarrassed. They won't mind. So that's great. I think if you are not hardworking or ambitious, it might be harder than it was before. But for people who are willing to put in the work, I think it's a better time.
To that point, we had a guest on the podcast previously, Keith Hoodlet, and we were talking about how his teams, as they're looking at AI, they are constantly interrogating it, right? So they don't trust the output. They're going to go validate the output. And we see is when then you have that mindset of like working with, but the AI you're not working for the AI, you're working with the AI. Then you get like this really cool multiplicative effect. You get this great not additive, multiplicative, that's not the word. But then there's the other side of the folks there's another part of the bell curve where they just want nothing to do with AI. And he's like, they have a place, they can do their thing. But there's also this tranche, this 50% in the middle, right? Who are just going to use the system, trust the system, and not interrogate it. And I think that's kind of where you're getting into is like, if you have the personality traits and you're not leaning in on the creativity, you're not leaning in the principles thinking, you're not doing the hard work and the grit, then you end up in the middle. That's gonna be a really rough day, because at that point you are just competing with an LLM, and that's just a dangerous place to be in, right? You want to be working with it, not against it.
Totally. And I think oftentimes it can spit out things that look very convincing, but are not actually a vulnerability, for example. I think maybe I don't know if this is a spicy take, but you were just talking about sort of the distribution of how people feel. I think there are people who are like, AI is going to change everything, totally revolutionize everything. It is already thinking. And then there's people who are like, it can't think, it will never think. And I have maybe like a middle take on that. So let's say, for example, you're like, I don't know if AI really can understand code, for example. And let's say, ignore whether it's actually understanding or not, or what even understanding means. I think if it can do things that are provably, observably useful in terms of, so for example, I want to do some simple data analysis and I don't know exactly the libraries to use. I've had a number of cases where I just describe like, here's what my data looks like. I want a bar chart where the x-axis is this, the y-axis is this, and then it like one shot writes a script that does the thing. And it like runs perfectly the first time. So does it understand? I don't know. But in terms of like, is it practically useful? I would say yes. So I think I would ask less, does it understand? Is it conscious? Like these hand wavy things that are difficult to prove, and just be like, does it actually work in practice? Yes or no? And add a high enough rate of accuracy and confidence that it's useful. So that's how I think about it.
I mean, I can't even guarantee my own consciousness.
It's true.
So, it's like if people are worried about like how AIs would be conscious. I love the work that's coming out of Run Sybil. I think they're a really great firm. And I think it's gonna be a really interesting moment when you start to see the chaining effect of these AIs. And like, I've heard some researchers in the space being like, more LLMs together just gives you more problems and more headaches. But I do think maybe we get to the point, I want your take on this. Do you see a world where these LLMs start to string together with the right level of scaffolding, they've got the right context, where you do see them able to go and be more effective at a task? Again, coming back to pen testing as the example, where you can see them kind of working together.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a couple thoughts. So I think initially when people were building systems, it was largely sort of like a deterministic workflow where some individual steps might be like, pass this context to an LLM, get something back, and then have, say, Python code decide what to branch do based on that. So that's sort of like traditional deterministic programming with like little LLM bits here and there. And then you have more like agentic workflows where you have an LLM itself which is deciding like what to do next, and maybe it does a series of investigations and things like that. I think that, so one key thing about that is that models need to be good at basically keeping a set of things to do in their mind and then executing them rigorously. And that often requires, at least right now, some like deterministic normal programming language code to do that reliably, consistently. So I'll give you a specific example. Let's say, so actually I did a webinar recently with my friend Scott Behrens, who's a principal security at Netflix, security engineer at Netflix, super smart guy. And so we built sort of this orchestration where it's like, let's try to find vulnerabilities in a repo automatically. So there's sort of an orchestrator prompt that's like, okay, cool. You call the next things. And then first it's like, let's build a threat model of the application. Then let's scan for vulnerabilities, both using Semgrep as well as the LLM itself. And then finally, let's sort of triage them, see if they're true positives, and then finally write a report. So basically understand, find bugs, write report. So what I'm getting at is after the find bugs, it might find like 13 things. And then the next step is like write all of those up into like a more detailed report. But oftentimes like the report is like missing things from a prior step when there's not really like, that's not a hard thing. Like any junior person would be like, I have 13 things from previous step. Next step should have 13 things also. Right. So just ensuring consistency and things like that as the agentic chain gets longer, I think is currently a challenge, which people are largely solving through like deterministic, like normal programming language scaffolding, as you said. So I think scaffolding is hugely important. And I think when people say, can an AI system do this or can't it? I think there's like the model capability, but then there's also what we build around it. And I think that can get like 2 to 5x, maybe 10x better performance.
Do you think there's currently a misconception or maybe like a trust level problem with how confident people are in LLM output?
In terms of people are too confident, not
People are
confident
too
enough?
confident in the outcomes of what they're and the output that they're seeing from LLMs. You talk about the reports and how they come out and there's some inconsistencies. Do you think everyone's picking up on those inconsistencies, or they're actioning some of the items that they're receiving without really? We talked about validating. Do you think there's a lack of validation because it seems incredible, like such confidence, incredibly articulate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think people who are building their own things and very familiar with it, like people who are, I think, optimistic about it, but have actually used it themselves, I think usually vet the results pretty well. I think maybe the people who are buying into the hype, but not as much having built something themselves or practitioners, I think are more likely to just action them without thinking it through.
The Dubai tech bros.
Potentially, yes.
So actually, a little anecdote there. The other day, I was looking through one of the many reports we get from the industry, and I was like looking through it. And so I uploaded it into OpenAI, and I was like, "Hey, like just run through this. Like, give me the highlights. Give me an executive summary. What are the key facts and what are the key observations of the report?" And I looked at it. I'm like, "Okay, I'm like, that one doesn't make sense." I'm like, that can't be right. And it's okay. Fact check yourself, which you should use other LLMs to check itself. You can't say check your own homework, because what I got was, "Yep, everything looks good." And then I'm like, "Surely this can't be right. Like, show me the source." And I went and looked through the document and couldn't find it anywhere in the document. And so I called out the LLM and I was just like, "Hey, like this was inaccurate. You made a mistake. Like I can't trust you, da da da." And it was like apologized profusely and then gave his whole speech. I'm like, "Why didn't you just do that up front?" You know? But it was a sense of like, it gave it to me in a clear and high confidence way. It then checked itself and still said it was true. And only after the human stepped in and said like, "Actually, you're wrong," it was like, "Oh yeah, I was wrong. And here is why I was wrong." So a small like kind of anecdotal, but it's just a good reminder that we're in this stage of high confidence, but not perfection. And I think that's okay if we recognize it's not perfect. I think the trouble is when we see executives or senior leaders or AI get into the headspace that it's magic. Like that's a dangerous place to be, in the headspace where you think the LLM is magic.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think that's certainly not helped by a number of security vendors that are just sort of claiming like we solve all the problems.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, ultimately it's about like how can we like what are the underlying security fundamentals? Like how do we enable the business to operate at an acceptable level of risk at like a reasonable cost? And I think AI is one tool, but it's not the solution in itself.
Totally agree. So you recently had a really good conversation with Phil from Google on your podcast, on your podcast and then the newsletter, and you were talking about this concept of shifting down instead of shifting left. Would you mind just expanding on that framework and just help the audience understand like what was the key message that you guys were trying to communicate there? Because I thought it was really kind of an insightful and different way of approaching this problem as we start to move in an environment which has got increased speed and complexity.
Totally. So shout out Phil Venables, former CISO of Google Cloud, former CISO Goldman Sachs. He runs one of the best security blogs on the internet, in my opinion. So really cool guy. And I think it's not totally a new idea. Like the Google's book, Building Secure and Reliable Systems, I think also talked about this. My friend John Steven, I interviewed him a while ago, also talked about this. But sort of the idea is rather than so originally, all the software is written, you run some heavyweight tools at the end, and then, 3 months later, you send this PDF of bugs to developers. Rightly, they're not happy, right? So then the next step, we're like, okay, cool. Well, let's like immediately when they're pushing code into GitHub in a pull request or something like that, let's scan it there and give them feedback then, right? Great. It's much sooner. It's still in their brain context so they can fix it quickly. So shifting left, that's great. You can also shift even further left in the IDE where they write code, you give them feedback, this is broken, please fix. So tightening the feedback cycle, which is all great. But I think the idea is instead of making developers change behavior or become security experts, like they're already great at a lot of things, right? They're shipping features on tight timeframes. They can build sort of fast, reliable systems. Like all these things require a lot of expertise that us security people probably don't have, like realistically. At least I don't. However, like what if we can make it so they don't have to care about security? is sort of the idea. Like, can we make security invisible, sort of orthogonal to their job? So the shifting down is basically like, can we build security primitives into the programming languages they use, the frameworks, the libraries they use? So for example, if you write C or C++, you have to care about memory safety.
Yeah.
Not great, very hard, even for security people. But in, say, Python or Java, you don't have to care about that as much. Similarly, so Google, Netflix, and others have given talks about, like, how can we take the things that are often security foot guns for developers that just take a lot of complexity and just be like, you don't have to care about that anymore. Right. So for output encoding, if you're building a web app, like, cool, we're just going to give you this library that's like makes XSS impossible. Just use this and don't even, like, you don't have to talk to us. So it's a great, the idea is like engineering is able to move faster and ship higher quality code without even like blocking on security. So they're happy, they can do their jobs better and faster, and security is happy because classes of vulnerabilities, whether that's like XSS with output encoding, parameterized queries with SQL injection, parsing XML with XXE, like, you could imagine a security engineering team building secure by default ways to do all the things that developers normally have to do, and then they don't care about it, and they go about their day very happy.
What I liked about that is that everything you just said, no AI required. Just good first principles thinking of how do you build systems that are oriented towards making the life of the developer easier and keeping them on their current day job.
Now let's bring it back to AI.
Okay.
I've got a great question. So can you foresee a world where vibe coding meets shift down?
Yeah, so I think
vibe coding.
Yeah, totally. So I, based on chats I had with a bunch of people, it wasn't originally my idea. Even maybe 2017, 2018, I was trying to give more talks at conferences about sort of secure defaults and giving case studies from a bunch of companies, whether it was Netflix, Google, DocuSign, Facebook, or Meta, like all these companies that have done this effectively. And what I found is that it can be very hard for a company to do this in practice. You need like a security engineering team who's building these primitives that developers can then use. And it's just like a lot of work. So to your point, I think it's actually a very exciting time with vibe coding and AI in terms of, can we sort of democratize secure defaults, which eliminates classes of vulnerabilities rather than one-off bugs here and there, which sort of detection tools like pen testing or SAST or DAST or things do. So I think I'm actually very optimistic about it. I think Phil talked a little bit about this when I spoke with him. And basically the idea is, so your company, maybe it has like a wiki, maybe it has some sort of internal documentation that's like, hey, here, this is how we write code. So if this is like a wiki, you're probably not reading it all the time. If it's a security training you take when you onboard, you probably forget it in a few months. Like, let's be real. But imagine you are using Cursor or some sort of LLM augmented code writing process. And let's say that is hooked up either sort of programmatically, or it's just in a Cursor rule file or sort of a Claude code like context. Basically, every vibe coding IDE or tool has a way to say, this is how we write code in this repo, whether that's like a YAML file on disk or just like a markdown file. All of them have this, basically. They're called different things.
I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt your thought there, but like, I think most security leaders are sleeping on this. Like, I think this is actually a really great way to get your objectives from a security organization integrated with engineering. There's never been a time where we can literally get on the same page and say, like, this is what bad looks like, this is what good looks like. And when you're generating code, here are the guardrails. And you can just feed that into the system. It's just a really, in my opinion, a really good starting point. It's certainly not the end of the journey, but it's a really good place just to make sure the LLM is starting to be conscientious. And basically, we're making the LLM aware that there are security ramifications to the code is about to give the engineer. So therefore, stay away from libraries that are known to be vulnerable to XSS or whatever the case may be. And being really specific about that. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt your thought. I just wanted to say that.
No, definitely. I think you're exactly right. I think people are sleeping on this. And if I've been wanting to write about this, and I haven't written about it yet, so I guess you can
Now's a great time.
You can hear it first now. I think my prediction is that there's a couple different ways this could work, but I think there's the potential with the right engineering for vibe coding to potentially be more secure than just normally writing code, due to exactly what you've described, pulling in context of best practices for writing secure code, whether that's your company specific things or OWASP or whatever. So I think that that has the potential, even as 2 to 5x more code is written,
Yeah.
it's actually more secure, at least from OWASP top 10 issues. Logic and business logic flaws are different and will require a different approach.
Right.
We can talk about that too, but from like XSS, SQL injection, like the basic things that like we shouldn't do this anymore. I think those could be maybe not solved, but significantly addressed soon, like in 2 to 3 years.
I'd like to get your perspective on something. So I've had a lot of conversations, and the answer I get back is often the answer like human in the loop and human in the loop. And I feel that we're at a moment in their industry where we can do human in the loop well, or we can do it poorly. And I have this perspective that I want to get your take on this concept of how do we do human in the loop well in this moment, and how does that morph over time? Because I do see a world where if we're trying to say we have agentic coding or vibe coding, and we are giving our engineers this great capacity to have more output, sheer volume. And if our answer as an industry is we're going to have the analyst look at every pull request and fact check and say yes or no, like that's going to be a really bad day for that analyst or that AppSec engineer. So I am wondering your perspective, and maybe challenge mine on this, is do we end up going down this world where the security community starts focusing more on having like a governance model? So you can have your rules right there in the IDE that says, here's from a cursor or whatever perspective that I want the LLM to get aligned on good security practices. Then of course, and then as we go from left and we go right, we go from more probabilistic to less probabilistic and more deterministic. So like maybe the rule sets are getting tighter. There you are, now you're at production. And you've got maybe under the hood some AI governance model that's like checking things and giving coaching feedback and such all the way until you get to the end. I would just kind of, hopefully I've articulated that in a halfway decent way, but do you see a world where security stops becoming humans like doing all the pull requests, and we then start to have a model that is helping the security engineers, and it might be taking care of, let's say, all the pull requests where 95% confidence interval is appropriate, and then the 5% where the confidence interval must be 100%, then we're handing those off to the engineers. It's just a thought that I've had emerging over the last couple of weeks, and I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Totally. With regards to do we have a human in the loop versus totally agentically writing code? At least as of today, I think that it's useful to have a human in the loop, because just sometimes it can go off the rails, and something that could have been 10 lines of code is like 200 lines of code, which is fine if it's a prototype. But if this is like a production system that you're going to maintain, like you kind of do care about the code a little bit. You can't rely only on vibes. And so I think for writing code, I think human in the loop, at least at some level, like reviewing the code, not just from a security point of view, but just like, does this make sense sort of thing? I think at least for the next bit is important. To answer your question, like how does AI fit in? I think all the different touch points you mentioned, assuming that some sort of AI code review bot, whether that's for security or even engineering best practices, both from like a cursor or Claude Code rules, as well as in the PR, as well as further in the pipeline. I think as long as it's finding things at an acceptable level of cost and like a low level of noise, I'd say like, why not? Right. Yeah, I guess that's another thing, just touching on this, that people, because of like the cost is like tokens with AI, people don't think about it as much, where previously we've been used to tools that are either open source, or if you have a commercial vendor, you're probably thinking about like, well, how much per year does it cost to run this tool? And it's not a usage-based model mostly.
Per seat,
yeah. So for example, like, just because I know this space more, so people who are used to buying SaaS tools, for example, they're like, okay, cool, it's charged by, let's say, lines of code or number of developer seats or number of repos or whatever the vendor says. But they probably aren't thinking about like charging by scan. Right. So like if you have like 1 million lines of code and you want to scan all of them, like how many tokens is that? What model are you using? Like each scan does cost like actual money, like tens or hundreds of dollars.
And it's only going to go up as well, right?
Yeah.
Today is the cheapest day that you're going to have access to any LLM tool. That's just like, you look at how much they're losing money right now, like that's only going to go up. So I do think we're going to get to an interesting point where that cost benefit analysis, I think everyone sees this as free/cheap now. As the prices go up, do you see like the human review of code, probably like the security engineer coming in as a better cost proposition in the future than potentially an AI scanner longer term?
Yeah, it's a great point. Like, so recently we saw Cursor have like a use as much as you want model, and then they were like, wait a second, we are burning all of our money. And then even Anthropic, like Claude Code was so popular that even the model provider themselves were like, hey, we need like another tier, we're going to do usage limits. So I think that similar to the beginning of Uber and Lyft, where rides were like super, super cheap, at some point, someone's got to pay the piper in terms of like, here's our actual cost in terms of electricity and data centers and things like that. So it's unclear what the future cost is going to be. I will say model performance so far keeps getting a lot better year on year. And then the same model today will be like 20% of the cost next year. So it is getting cheaper in that way. But if you care about using the greatest, it is still like expensive.
And I do think we're going to get to a point of this is my personal opinion, is we're going to get model dependency, and we're going to get businesses hooked on models, and then you charge what you want, right? Like that's my view of what I think will happen to a decent amount of corporate America. This might take 5, 10, 15 years, but I think we're going to get model addiction. And it's just going to be an interesting thing to watch play out. I don't know if that's something that you've had much thought about, but it's something like, I go into lots of different tangents of what the world's going to look like with AI. And I do think there's going to be a level of model dependency. I don't know if that's something you've thought about.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because like if I were to take that model dependency as an idea and like put it next to it, like you could imagine this company is like an AWS shop, and moving to Azure is going to be like, 3 years and millions of dollars to rewrite everything. So far, it seems like there's been a number of libraries that basically make it easy to transparently switch between model providers, so that so far it seems people are very mercenary with AI models in terms of like, currently, let's say Claude Opus is the best at coding, but then like, let's say the next GPT-5 is better at coding. I think a lot of people are just immediately switching. So there seems to be about as much loyalty as people have for airlines, at least currently, in terms of like best price that has an acceptable level of service.
Let's not talk about what AI is doing with airlines. You told me about Delta.
Yeah, I know. That's
I heard about that. Yeah.
And just like airlines, we'll hope that the plane arrives with all the doors attached, and like that'll be our standard. We're choosing right.
Yeah, like 80% of the time,
80% of the time
lands with all.
80% of the time, it works 100% of the time. Yes, exactly. So there's this other aspect, right? So we're re-platforming our businesses off of deterministic software, and we're starting to like figure out where do we go into these agentic processes. And there is a supply chain risk that's starting to emerge now. And I just want to get your thoughts on this, particularly with like, we could talk about the model security, and then there's the security of the LLMs themselves. They have this like, these pickle files in the middle. I think a lot of people like aren't aware of the risks that are happening when you serialize that Python code. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of like talking about what that looks like, but maybe also expand it into just the supply chain risk around the AI infrastructure that these corporations are starting to adopt, and maybe touch on some of the security risks and maybe some of the best practices that we could be adopting to help mitigate that.
Sure. So like with any new technology, lots of exciting new security risks.
Yep.
So let's see, I'll try to list a number of them. I probably won't be able to list them all offhand.
Because there's a lot.
Because there's a lot. But yeah, there's also various OWASP, Gen AI security guides. So just to give a couple of examples. So prompt injection. So interestingly, a lot of things in security are like not new. Like new technology, same idea. So basically this idea of mixing the control and data plane, like what is data to be operated on and what is like telling you what to do. That mixing, that basically cross-site scripting, right, is like user data being executed as JavaScript. SQL injection is user data being executed as SQL. So with AI, prompt injection is, again, user input being operated on as like instructions to the model rather than data that should be, say, classified for sentiment or like whatever the prompt is trying to do. So I think that attack is interesting because it so far seems unsolved by everyone. Like every model provider is like, and I think Sam Altman said a number of years ago, like, yeah, we're totally like prompt injection is not going to be a thing in like 1 year or 2 years. And he said that like 4 years ago or something. I don't know.
It will continue to be a thing until we re-architect it, right? Until we have a way of separating. I mean, the DeepMind put out their framework around Camel as a kind of suggestions, a few others that are coming up. Yeah, until we change the architecture, that problem is just going to hang around.
Yeah, totally. So some other work in that space, yeah, like the Camel from Google, interesting paper. Um, I think Simon Willison maybe proposed like sort of the dual agent model where you have like the agent or model that takes user input, and then another that has like the privileged access to your email or other sensitive things, and then there's like a well-defined interface between the two. So like the thing receiving user input cannot just arbitrarily call all the other things, which is nice because there's been a couple of write-ups recently about how like the GitHub MCP, the GitLab MCP, basically all of them were like, since the same thing can access your, say, private repo or private issues,
Yes.
but also operate on, say, public issues or comments or things like that, or on source code. So basically, you can make it do things that it has access to legitimately, but it's not the intention of the user. Um, let's see. I think the Trail of Bits folks recently released a proxy that you can sort of put in between your agent and all the different MCPs. So it is looking, for, say, prompt injection and things like that, as well as sort of to your supply chain point, I think really nice, where it basically looks at the tools offered by each of these servers you're connecting to, and basically I think like takes a hash, or basically it's like, okay, here's the set of things you've trusted, and then if in the future they were to switch that to something malicious, it'll like reprompt you, and it won't just sort of like blindly start serving you new malicious things, which is I think the first thing I've seen to do that yet, which is exciting because that was a big risk that it didn't seem people were addressing yet, at least that I've seen.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, like MCP servers are authorized to take action. And so when you switch under the hood from like good intention to bad intention and you don't reprompt the users, there is a real problem with that, right? So they've done some really good research in starting to put out some like thoughtful guardrails that are integrating into how engineers like do their day job, right? Just kind of getting integrated there.
Totally. So some other risks, like if you are vibe coding and it might recommend packages that don't exist, which someone might typo squat. So I think Socket and others have put some good research out about that. Let's see. If you're loading random models from, say, Hugging Face, anyone can put things there. So if it's a pickle file, pickle can run arbitrary code. So you're basically just running arbitrary code on your machine when you run a model. So you're like, I'm running an AI model, and it's like, well, also arbitrary code.
Right. And what I find interesting about that particular example there is in Hugging Face, you get the model and you're like, great, it's supposed to do this thing. But when you do a static scan of the model, you're just going to see what you're going to see, but you're not going to see the serialized commands, the malicious commands. It's only at runtime. When you're actually running the thing, it gets deserialized and then the commands get executed. So unless you have like this proactive runtime defense around those LLM models, you're pretty blind to it all the way through. There's some ways you can mitigate the risk along the way, but I think it's what it comes back to. Get your thoughts on just how do organizations start to get their hands around that, right? Do they start saying, okay, nothing off a Hugging Face. It's got to come from, like in the same way we do with containers, an authorized container repository. And now it needs to come from a model registry that we have. Like, would that be a good suggestion? Or how do we start to, I don't know, not to say like what's the answer to all of the problems, but if you were to have an answer for like some of those problems that kind of get overlooked sometimes, I would just love to get your perspective on that particular one.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure if there is a Hugging Face equivalent to like Artifactory or whatever that, to your point, is like a private, these are our sort of blessed approved models that we want you to use. That probably exists. I haven't seen it yet, but I feel like that should exist if it doesn't already.
Yeah.
That seems like a great solution. But in terms of just if you want sort of frontier capability, it seems like using directly from the foundation model provider seems to be the best approach yet. I guess overall, from like an implementation point of view, it seems like people tend to prototype using the best models they have available. Basically, like, can we prove that this actually works? And then once you can prove it works, like, okay, what is the cheapest, most cost-effective model we can use that still gives a reasonable level of performance? Because there are some things that you're like, I don't know if this is really possible. So let's use like the best tool we can. Cool, it actually works. Okay, now how can we do that at like 90% accuracy for like the least cost possible?
I would love to get some of your spicy takes. I know we talked about this before, but what are some of the takes that you have on the future landscape with AI, with insecurity, or just in general with AI and how we're at the kind of a revolution, it seems like, in some people's eyes? Like, what are your thoughts and what are your takes?
Okay, I'll try to do just like a couple.
Let's do it.
So
Rapid fire.
one that we talked a little bit about before. I think whether or not models understand doesn't matter. It's just, does it do economically useful things?
Yeah.
Does it give you good enough results given sort of the time and cost?
Yeah.
That who cares what it's doing? It's working.
Yeah.
I think it's maybe not spicy, but just observation. I think domains in which you can validate the result are great use cases. So oftentimes it'll create a bunch of things. Some of them are going to be wrong, but if you can automatically validate the result, it's a great use case.
Yeah.
So for example, a bunch of people, especially the Google Project Zero and DeepMind teams, had some fuzzing projects where, fuzzing, you have usually some sort of native code, you just throw a bunch of garbage at it, and then ideally it crashes. And when it does, you're like, I found a bug.
Yeah.
Right. So it's very obvious when you found a bug because the program crashes. And if you're running it with the right sanitizers, you can see, oh, there was a memory error here. And you're like, cool. The hard thing about fuzzing is getting it to execute the different program paths. What's good at writing lots of unit tests?
Yeah.
LLMs. Right. So perfect use case. You can validate if it did something useful, and you could generate thousands of harnesses. 90% of them could be garbage, but the time it would take a human to do that might be cost-wise more. So I think any domain in which you can validate the results programmatically without needing a human, huge opportunity in LLMs. So I think fuzzing, lots of offensive security type work. I think, let's see, spicy takes, again, I think, yeah, maybe secure defaults plus when integrated into vibe coding is going to make most software or code base agnostic issues significantly less. So I would sort of differentiate between, so if you're like an e-commerce application, you don't want people to be able to buy things without spending money. That's like a business logic issue.
Yep.
Whereas cross-site scripting, SQL injection, these can happen in any app. It doesn't matter what it does. So I would say for those sort of generic OWASP type bugs, I think those are going to go way down.
I would love to see that because the top 10 have been the top 10 for the last 15 years. So it'd be great for us to take a material swing at reducing, take a good swing at materially reducing the amount of these common vulnerabilities that we see in applications over and over and over again.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a long tail in terms of adoption. So I don't think this is going to happen immediately. But I guess sort of the distilled spicy take without like the nuance around it is AI is going to meaningfully change the OWASP top 10 for the better by making some issues nigh non-existent.
Yeah.
Eventually.
I'm hopeful that the OWASP top 10 comes down. I'm just watching the OWASP top 10 for LLMs. I'm hoping that
Top
one
64.
doesn't head back up. We don't, because we have a brand new infrastructure to all these for AI. Now we're gonna have new capabilities. We're gonna have new threats. So maybe we like rob Peter to pay Paul. Or maybe I'm too cynical. I don't know.
That doesn't sound like you. Last question from my end. Let's say you're doing a talk, you're at Stanford or Georgia Tech, bunch of kids who want to get in the cybersecurity world. What are you telling them in where they should focus now if they're about to kickstart a career in cybersecurity?
So some of the advice I think would be the same in terms of there's many areas of cybersecurity, some of which are going to be more exciting to you than others. So I think just dabbling in a bunch is useful, and even knowing what the buckets are.
Yeah.
I remember when I was trying to break in, I was like, I don't even know what security means.
Yeah.
Like, what are the so I'd say do a little bit in terms of, what does being in detection response look like, or application security or cloud security. So I think dabbling a little bit. And sort of choosing one to pursue a little bit.
Do you see any of them becoming obsolete in the shorter, like in the nearer term?
There are some that have been and continue to be less beginner friendly. So I think like if you're trying to be like some sort of exploit developer or a red team operator or focus in cryptography, things like that, there's just a huge barrier to entry. So I would say, if you want to get there, start somewhere else first.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense to start wherever you can get in your foot in the door.
Yeah.
Security consulting historically has been a great way to do that. And for me, it was foundational in terms of touching a bunch of things very quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you can get a security consulting role, I think it's a great place to start.
And you learn the why, right? Like in security consulting, there's a means to an end, right? Because there's an output, there's a product, there's a customer, right? I think sometimes when you're internal facing, you never actually understand the context of why you're doing what you're doing. So I think it's a wonderful way to start a career.
Totally. And I think for all these things, yeah, just use AI as a thought partner. Try vibe coding.
Yeah.
I think in the future, being able to read and write code, it's already been growing in importance for regardless of what area of security. So whether you're in cloud security or detection and response or application security, I think being able to read and write code only more important.
Look at some of the GRC functions 10 years ago that you would never imagine that. But more recently, you look at like some of the GRC automation, GRC engineering, Netflix is one of the places that kind of pioneered that. But it's 10 years ago, you'd have never heard of that. So it's fascinating that it touches every area now.
Totally. I've even heard of compliance as code. Dare I say it?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really good. Well, Clint, we got to talk about this before we came on before we came on camera. We got to share with you that I've been a massive fan of your work for many years now. When I got my, most previously when I was joining as a CISO of my previous organization, I reached out to my friends and I said like, hey, I've got this incredible like application security landscape. I've got all these business units with this different technology, some federal, some customer. Like, what do you recommend? And I kind of talked to some people. I kind of got like generic answer. Then I asked my friend James Chiappetto over at Blackstone. He's like, dude, the answer is super simple. Subscribe to TLDRsec and read it every week. So I just want to say thank you for the work you're doing in that. It's been as someone who is a consumer of the hard work that you put into it. I love the quality. I love the takes. I love the resources that you put in there. I think as a CISO, it's really great. It helps me stay grounded in what's actually helping reduce the risk for my organization. So I just want to say on camera here, thank you for the work you've been doing on that.
Yeah, thanks so much. That means a lot. I really appreciate it.
Well, Clint is one of the most trusted minds when it comes to guiding security leaders, myself and others included, through this AI transformation. So the easiest thing you can do is subscribe to TLDRsec, subscribe to the Modern Security podcast, and stay connected with him on LinkedIn. And for those of you who are definitely going to be pushing the boundaries on AI security, I recommend that you follow his GitHub repository on the prompt injection defenses. It's one of the principal risks that I see are facing most organizations. And there's a ton of great resources on technical artifacts you can use in your projects today. So again, Clint, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. And shout out to Rami McCarthy for having a huge role in putting that repo together.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. And we'll link to all of that in the show notes. Yes.
Thanks, Clint.
Thank you.